The day my neighbor finally paid to tear down a brand new fence he'd spent thousands of dollars installing, I stood in my backyard with a cup of coffee and watched the whole thing happen without saying a word. The funny part wasn't that the fence was coming down. The funny part was that 6 months earlier he'd looked me straight in the eye and basically told me there was nothing I could do about it. If you've ever had someone mistake your patience for weakness, then you'll probably understand exactly why this story still makes me smile. My name is Daniel Harper, and for almost 12 years I lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, in a modest white house sitting on a corner lot with a backyard that stretched farther than most properties around it. It wasn't some giant estate. It wasn't worth a fortune, but it was mine. I bought that place after my divorce when I was 43 years old. It was the first thing in a long time that actually felt stable. My daughter Emily spent summers there before college. My old golden retriever Cooper chased squirrels under the trees for years. I planted every flower bed myself. When you've lived somewhere long enough, property lines stop feeling like measurements on a survey map and start feeling like part of your personal history. The backyard had always been open. No fences, no barriers, just grass, a few mature maple trees, and enough space that the neighborhood felt less crowded than it actually was. For over a decade, nobody questioned where one yard ended and another began. Then everything changed when the house directly behind mine sold. The previous owners were retirees named Walter and Janice. Quiet people. We'd wave occasionally. Sometimes we'd talk about weather or football across the yard. Nothing dramatic. Then they moved to Florida and sold the property to a younger couple named Ryan and Madison Keller. The first thing I noticed about them was how quickly they wanted to change everything. Within days, there were contractors everywhere. Roofers, landscapers, painters, delivery trucks showing up every morning. It looked less like someone moving into a home and more like someone launching a construction project. At first, I didn't care. People can do whatever they want with their property. In fact, I figured improving the house might even help my own property value. But after a few weeks, I started noticing something else. Ryan had a habit of talking like every conversation was a negotiation he had already won. You know the type. The guy who asks questions he doesn't actually want answers to. The guy who explains things nobody asked him to explain. The guy who somehow manages to sound friendly and arrogant at exactly the same time. One afternoon while I was trimming bushes near the driveway, he wandered over holding a tape measure. He looked around and said, "Man, you got lucky with this lot. If this yard was mine, I'd probably fence the whole thing in." I laughed and said, "That's why it's good that it's not yours." He laughed too, but there was something in his expression that stayed with me afterward. A few days later, contractors arrived carrying stacks of cedar fence panels, fresh lumber, new posts, concrete bags, hardware, the works. I figured they were fencing their own yard, which made sense. Plenty of people like privacy fences. The crew worked all day. I could hear post-hole diggers running from my kitchen window. By evening, most of the structure was standing. That's when I stepped onto my porch and felt that strange little tug in the back of my mind. Something looked off. Not dramatically off. Just wrong enough that I couldn't ignore it. The fence seemed closer than it should have been. I stood there staring at it while the sun went down, trying to convince myself it was just an optical illusion. Maybe the angle was different. Maybe I hadn't paid attention before. Maybe I was imagining things. But the next morning, I grabbed a measuring tape. I wish I could tell you I immediately knew there was a problem, but honestly, the first few measurements only confused me more. I measured from an old maple tree that had been there longer than any house on the block. Then I measured again. Then a third time. Every measurement told the same story. 8 feet. 8 entire feet were missing. Now, 8 feet might not sound like much when you're talking about a football field, but in a residential backyard it's huge. Suddenly, the fence wasn't sitting near the property line. It was sitting deep inside what I had always understood to be my property. I stood there staring at the numbers, trying to think of another explanation. Maybe the original property records were wrong. Maybe I remembered the dimensions incorrectly. Maybe there was some easement I didn't know about. But deep down, I already knew the truth. So that afternoon, I walked to Ryan's front door and knocked. A few seconds later, he opened it with a smile. "Hey Daniel, what's up?" I told him I thought the fence might be over the property line. His smile faded just enough for me to notice. Then he shrugged and said, "The contractor followed the survey markers." I asked if I could see the survey. He said he didn't have it. I asked who performed it. He said he'd have to check. I suggested we verify everything before the project was completely finished. He folded his arms and glanced toward the backyard. Honestly, the fence looks pretty good where it is. It was such a simple sentence, but something about it bothered me all evening. Because he wasn't saying the fence was correct. He was saying he liked the result. And those are two very different things. At dinner that night, I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering whether this was a misunderstanding or the beginning of something much bigger. By the time I went to bed, I had already made a decision. If there was one thing I wasn't going to do, it was argue over guesses. I wanted facts. And the next morning, I picked up the phone and scheduled a professional surveyor to come out and settle the question once and for all. 3 days later, a survey truck pulled into my driveway, just after 8 in the morning, and I remember feeling oddly nervous watching it arrive, because part of me still hoped I was wrong. Life is easier when you're wrong about things like this. If the measurements in my head were off, I could laugh about it, apologize for wasting everyone's time, and move on. Instead, I spent the next several hours watching a man named Carl walk my property with equipment that looked expensive enough to launch satellites. He was in his late 50s, quiet, methodical, the kind of guy who didn't say much unless he knew exactly what he was talking about. Every now and then I'd wander outside and ask how things were going. And every time he'd just nod and say, "Still checking." Around lunchtime, he finally motioned for me to come over. I followed him toward the back corner of the yard where several bright orange flags had been placed in the ground. Then he pointed toward the new fence. "That's your property line," he said, indicating the flags. Then he pointed again. "And that's definitely not." I looked from the flags to the fence and back again. The difference wasn't small. It wasn't a few inches. It wasn't even a foot or two. The fence sat roughly 8 feet inside my property boundary for nearly the entire length of the lot. Carl handed me a copy of the preliminary measurements and shook his head. Whoever installed that never verified the line properly. Hearing a professional say it out loud somehow made the whole thing feel more real. Suddenly, it wasn't a suspicion anymore. It was a documented fact. I took photographs from every angle I could think of. The flags, the fence, the measurements, the markers, everything. Then I emailed the entire package to Ryan and Madison with a polite message explaining that the survey confirmed the encroachment and asking how they'd like to resolve it. I wasn't rude. I wasn't threatening. I gave them every opportunity to fix the situation gracefully. Then I waited. A day passed. Nothing. 2 days. Nothing. 5 days. Still nothing. By the end of the week, I started feeling less frustrated and more fascinated. Most people, when presented with clear evidence that they've made a mistake, at least acknowledge it. Even if they're angry. Even if they disagree. Silence felt deliberate. Finally, I walked over and knocked again. This time Madison answered first before calling Ryan to the door. The second he saw the survey paperwork in my hand, I could tell he already knew exactly why I was there. I explained that I hadn't heard back and wanted to discuss a solution. He sighed dramatically and rubbed the back of his neck. "Look, moving that fence is going to cost a fortune." I stared at him. "Ryan, it's 8 feet onto my property." He shrugged. "You still have a huge yard." For a second, I genuinely thought I'd misheard him. "Are you suggesting I just give you part of my land?" Another shrug. "I'm saying it's not really affecting you." That answer hit me harder than I expected. Not because of the land itself, but because of what it revealed. Up until that moment, I'd assumed we were dealing with a mistake. Maybe negligence. Maybe a careless contractor. But standing there on his porch, listening to him explain why I shouldn't care about losing property I legally owned, I realized this wasn't about an error anymore. This was about entitlement. He wasn't defending the fence because he thought it was correct. He was defending it because fixing it would inconvenience him. I remember looking past him into the house where renovation boxes were still stacked against the walls. Everything about their move seemed designed to project success. New cars, new deck furniture, fresh landscaping, every visible detail carefully upgraded. And suddenly I had a suspicion that went deeper than the fence itself. I started wondering whether the extra 8 feet had always been part of the plan. Whether making their backyard larger had simply been another improvement project. Whether they had convinced themselves that if they acted confidently enough, nobody would challenge them. The conversation ended badly. Not with shouting. Not with threats. Something colder. Ryan simply said, "I think you're making a bigger deal out of this than it needs to be." Then he closed the door. I stood on the porch for several seconds afterward, staring at my own reflection in the glass. Then I walked home. That night, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by property documents, deeds, survey records, county maps, easement information, every piece of paperwork I could find. At first, I was looking for leverage. What I found instead was something much more interesting. The strip of land behind Ryan's fence still legally belonged to me. Every inch of it. Which sounds obvious, but the practical implications took a while to sink in. Ownership isn't just the right to complain when someone uses your property. Ownership is the right to use it yourself. Around midnight, I leaned back in my chair and started smiling. Not because I'd discovered a way to hurt them. Because I'd discovered a way to solve the problem without arguing anymore. Over the next few days, I made phone calls. Lots of them. I spoke with surveyors, contractors, landscaping companies, zoning officials, and one particularly patient county employee who probably regretted answering my questions. Every conversation led me to the same conclusion. As long as I followed local regulations, I could build legal improvements on my own land, even if someone else's fence happened to be sitting there. A week later, a landscaping contractor named Mike came out to discuss an installation project. We walked the property together while he studied the survey markers. About halfway through the conversation, he stopped and laughed. Let me get this straight. Their fence is on your land. Yep. And they won't move it. Nope. He grinned. Well, this might be one of the more interesting jobs I've taken. The following Monday, his crew arrived. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. Ryan happened to be drinking coffee on his deck when a truck carrying equipment rolled into my driveway. Within minutes, workers were unloading materials while a compact excavator crawled across the grass. I could practically feel his confusion from across the property line. It didn't take long before he came walking over. What's all this? He asked. Landscaping project, I replied. What kind of landscaping project? The kind that goes on my property. He glanced toward the survey flags, then toward his fence, then back at me. For the first time since we'd met, he seemed genuinely uncomfortable. Work began immediately. Holes were dug in a perfectly straight line following the legal property boundary. Not the fence, the actual boundary. Every location had been measured and marked beforehand. By the end of the first day, several heavy steel support posts were standing upright in concrete foundations. Ryan watched nearly every minute of it from his deck. Occasionally, Madison joined him. Neither one looked particularly happy. The next morning, construction continued. More posts, more concrete, more measurements, more materials arriving. Around noon, Ryan finally approached again. This time his confidence seemed noticeably weaker. What exactly are you building? He asked. I looked at him for a moment before answering. A legal improvement on my property. Daniel, you had the survey. You know where the line is. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For perhaps the first time, he was beginning to understand that the situation wasn't going away, and the structure taking shape along that 8-foot strip was about to transform his beautiful new backyard in a way he never saw coming. By the end of the second day, the skeleton of the project was finished. 12 steel posts stood in a perfectly straight line across the entire disputed strip, each one buried deep in concrete, each one sitting exactly where the survey said my property began. Ryan kept watching from his deck, and I could tell the uncertainty was eating at him because every few hours he'd glance outside like he expected some official to arrive and tell everyone to stop. Nobody ever did. Everything was legal. Everything was permitted. Everything was happening on land that belonged to me. The following week, Mike's crew returned with the final materials. Large cedar planter boxes, heavy-duty liners, fresh soil, irrigation tubing. The project itself wasn't complicated, but it was effective. One by one, the planters were secured between the steel supports, creating a continuous line along the property boundary. Then came the bamboo. Not the decorative kind people put in small gardens. This was a fast-growing privacy variety specifically chosen because it could create a dense visual screen in a surprisingly short period of time. When the last plant went into the ground, the structure didn't look particularly impressive yet. In fact, if you saw it that first week, you probably would have wondered what all the fuss was about. But plants grow. That's what they do. Summer arrived, and the bamboo exploded. Every few weeks it seemed taller, thicker, denser. By late August, the transformation was impossible to ignore. What had started as a row of planters had become a living wall nearly 8 feet tall. Thick green stalks stretched upward while broad leaves filled every gap between them. The effect was dramatic. Ryan and Madison's expensive new deck no longer overlooked an open backyard. Instead, it faced what looked like a private jungle. Sunlight that once poured across their patio during the afternoon now disappeared behind a curtain of greenery. Their carefully landscaped flower beds spent much of the day in shade. Even from inside my house, I could occasionally hear frustrated conversations drifting over the fence. One Saturday morning, I was watering tomatoes in my garden when Ryan walked into my yard. The confidence he'd carried for months was gone. He looked tired. Not angry, just tired. "Can we talk?" he asked. I set the hose down. "Sure." He stared at the bamboo for several seconds before speaking. "This thing is ruining our backyard." I followed his gaze toward the wall. "You mean the structure on my property?" His jaw tightened. "You know what I mean." "I do." There was a long silence between us. For the first time, neither of us was pretending the issue was about anything other than the fence. Finally, he sighed. "What would it take to get rid of it?" I already knew the answer. I'd known for months. "Move your fence." He looked away. "That's going to be expensive." I nodded. "I imagine it is." Another silence. Then he gave a small laugh, the kind people make when they're finally forced to admit they've lost. "You're really not letting this go, are you?" I looked him directly in the eye. "Ryan, I tried to solve this 6 months ago." He didn't argue. Because he couldn't. Everything that happened afterward had been the result of a choice he made when he decided my property rights were less important than his convenience. 2 weeks later, a fencing company arrived. Ironically, it was the same company that had built the original fence. I watched from my porch as workers removed panel after panel. Posts were pulled from the ground. Concrete bases were broken apart and hauled away. The process took most of the day. At one point, I noticed one of the crew members studying the survey markers and shaking his head. Apparently, they understood exactly how the situation had unfolded. The new fence went up along the correct boundary line. No arguments. No shortcuts. No mysterious extra 8 feet. Just a straight, accurate property line exactly where it should have been from the beginning. Once the project was complete, I kept my promise. Mike's crew returned and removed the planter boxes. The bamboo was relocated to another property. Within days, sunlight returned to Ryan's backyard. His deck was visible again. The shade disappeared. And perhaps most importantly, my missing 8 feet of grass returned to me. Standing there afterward, looking across the restored property line, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. Not victory. Not revenge. Relief. Because disputes like this are exhausting. People always imagine these stories are satisfying because someone wins and someone loses. The truth is they're satisfying because eventually they end. A few months later, Ryan and I crossed paths while taking out our trash cans. For a second, it felt awkward, like we were both remembering everything that had happened. Then he surprised me. He looked over and said, "For what it's worth, you were right." It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was close enough. I nodded and said, "Probably would have been cheaper to move the fence the first time." He laughed. I laughed. And that was the end of it. At least mostly. Even now, years later, people occasionally ask whether I went too far. Some say the bamboo wall was brilliant because it forced accountability without breaking a single rule. Others think I should have taken the legal route immediately instead of making a point. Honestly, I still don't know. What I do know is that respect between neighbors matters a lot more than fences. Because the moment someone starts treating your property like it belongs to them, the real problem isn't the land. It's the attitude behind it. And that's what this whole situation was really about from the beginning. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, would you have done the same thing? Would you have fought the fence in court, ignored it completely, or built that bamboo wall exactly the way I did? Let me know down in the comments because I can already tell this is one of those stories where people are going to end up on very different sides. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates a little creative justice every now and then.